and we will go. Okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, Abby, will questions come up on the screen?
They will not come up on the screen, but I will have them, and I will interrupt you.
Perfect.
Because I'm good at that. So I'm going to go ahead and start. We're 5 o'clock here. I see that we've got about 18 people signed in as participants. So thank you, Second City Somms, for allowing us to divvy up some wines since we weren't able to go through and do the Somm boot camp that we had planned on doing at the end of March. Definitely want to welcome not only David LeMire, who is going to be on the right-hand side of your screen in the room at Sean Smith, Master of Wine David LeMire, but then also on the left we have, unbeknownst to all of you, special guest Michael Hill-Smith, who I also found out was going to join us, who is another MW from Sean Smith and Tolpuddle. They are going to guide you through the tasting. They will give you the parameters of how we are going to do the tasting. And then we do have, if you've participated before, there's a Q&A, and then we also have a chat ability with the webinars. So if you want to shout out questions, I will be managing the chat and the questions. So Q&A we'll do at the end, but if I see anything that comes through, I will interrupt David and Michael to ask that question if there is a question that's pertinent in the time of conversation. And then obviously everybody's available to chat as we go along with the chat feature. If I see anything in there that I think is worth shouting out, I will add it. But we will save about the last 15 minutes for questions, I think is a good time frame. We're not going to cut anybody off by any means. And I guess I would just defer to you, David and Michael, as far as how much time you want to allot overall. We don't have a time limit. We're not going to get cut off, but if anybody needs to leave, just give us a shout. And if we haven't answered your question before you have to go, we can certainly send you a follow-up email. So with that, I'll turn it over to David and Michael, and I'm super excited to do this virtually because I've done it in person, and we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to let you guys go. I'm going to mute myself and go from there. Okay.
Beautiful. Thanks, Abby.
Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's 7:30 a.m. here in the Adelaide Hills at Balhana, and Michael and I are also very excited to be looking at a really interesting little group of Chardonnays. And it's something that we enjoy doing and have done a few times over the journey. And Michael was the first person outside of the UK to do the Master of Wine, and that was back in '88. And he also won the Madame Bollinger Tasting Award. Was it the first Madame Bollinger?
Right.
It was. And so in terms of the history, the journey of Australian Chardonnay, and we were just reflecting how it's a bit tougher these days. I finished my MW in 2007, and even between then and now, the degree of difficulty, difficulty may be the wrong word, but the degree of complexity and the detail and the different shades that you see in Chardonnay, be it from Australia, California, New Zealand, not just California, the North America, France and other countries, is, it's complex and it's detailed, and it's, it is much more difficult, I think, to clearly kind of see where things are coming from. And we're also learning more and more about different regions and those regional characteristics, but also what's happening in the winery. And in some cases, people are making wines in styles that reflect each other in different parts of the world. And in other cases, they're quite different to their neighbours. So you've got a lot of different things going on. And we've certainly seen in Australia a great, particularly over the last decade, so much intensity of effort into growing good grapes in the right place, all of the clonal research, all of the work in the vineyard, and then a huge amount of more attention in the winery. And it's been a really exciting time for Chardonnay. in places like the Adelaide Hills, Margaret River, the Yarra Valley, Mornington, Tasmania. There's been this real movement, and I think these things don't happen. They don't tend to happen in isolation. It doesn't tend to be one person doing amazing things, on their own in a region. Maybe an exception to that in Australia. There are exceptions like Gary Farr down in Geelong, and
I would use the word cluster, but I don't think that it's a good word to use in the current situation.
Indeed, yeah, that's probably the right word. There's clusters of people competing against each other and really feeding off each other's expertise and experience, and that's what we've seen with Chardonnay in Australia.
Yes, I think it's probably fairly well known that the first sort of serious Chardonnays in Australia, or first serious Chardonnay, was made in the early 70s. So, we really haven't been making Chardonnay in Australia for that long. And, like a lot of wine areas and wine styles, people need to work out that they're planting the right thing in the right place. So, they need to get, there's a lot of Chardonnay that went into very warm regions. And whilst it makes perfectly credible wine in warm places, I don't think it makes great wine in warm places. So there's been a general move within Australia to cooler sites. And winemakers, like chefs, have learnt from what has happened before. So, you've got a pretty sophisticated group of very wine literate winemakers who have a very clear idea about what they want to do. And interestingly, even though the process in many cases is fairly similar, not identical, but similar, you still get this expression of place through the wines, which is sort of reassuring when you hear, oh, all the wine stays the same. That's just not the case. They're more nuanced. They're not as obvious as they were, back in '88 when I did my MW. The exams, the Californian Chardonnay looked like California, and the Australian Chardonnay looked Australian, and it wasn't as challenging. But the differences are still there. They're just more nuanced.
We do have a booklet, and Abby is going to email you that toward the end. The reason that we hold it back is just so that you can taste these wines without any preconceptions of what's in there, and you can look at them truly blind. So you've been sent samples that are numbered, and hopefully, all things working well, we've got the wines in the same order as you. There is one difference in that there's one wine which we didn't have in Australia, so there's one that's a different wine, but from the same region and the same quality level. So we will talk to that, and I think we've got in a reasonable substitute at this end as well. What this booklet has is a little bit of a history of the evolution of Australian Chardonnay, and it's all pretty concise. So it talks about the history of Chardonnay, which is a relatively recent history. The first commercial Chardonnay dating back to 1971, and made by Murray Tyrrell in the Hunter Valley. And it relays in here the story of Murray, who'd learnt that Penfolds had a little bit of Chardonnay at their Hunter Valley, the HVD vineyard, which stands for Hunter Valley Distillery. And he asked if he could take some cuttings, to which the answer was no. Undeterred, Murray jumped the fence and stole the cuttings. And that was an important moment in the history of Australian Chardonnay. In fact, one of the clones we don't see much of in South Australia was a clone called P58, stands for Penfolds 58, which is quite a popular clone in Victorian Chardonnay. In South Australia, we have a mix of some clones that came out of Davis, like I10V1, and more recently, a lot of the Bernard clones that are pretty common everywhere, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And the booklet has a bit of a rundown of the clones that are important in Australia. You've got a couple of those I10 clones. You've got the P58. You've got Mendoza, also known as Gin, although there's quite a mixed story with that clone. Some people are convinced there are two different clones. Brian Crows are among them. The Gin and Mendoza are slightly different. What we do know about that clone, as it's talked about in WA, is that it's prone to hen and chicken, and that you do have quite a high skin to juice ratio with Gin, and that's important in the style of wine that you're getting from there. And then 76, 95, 90, 96, those clones, a bit of 277. So there's a rundown of those in the booklet that you'll receive later, and a bit of chat about winemaking and philosophy. And I guess what we've seen in the last 20 years has been a move to much more refinement in Australian Chardonnays, much more sensitive use of oak and malo. And in some cases, and this reflects our experience, we moved away a bit from malo. But once we had the viticulture and the sites that had really high natural acidity and naturally low pHs, we were able to build back and re-embrace malo. And you'll see the results of that in these wines, or in at least some of these wines. Do you want to add anything, Michael?
Well, I think only that there's a lot of things happening in Australia, but I think if there's one story which is really capturing wine people around the world, is just the emergence of modern new wave Chardonnay. The wines from the best producers, from the best sites, are just spectacularly good wines. And for any of you living in a world where Burgundy, which at least David and I love, and I'm sure we all love, to find sophisticated wines with acid line that are really compelling wines outside of Burgundy is very exciting. And if you have a look at what's happening in Australia across quite a number of regions, but they tend to be cooler regions, there is just some terrific Chardonnay. And I'm lucky enough that having started to see those wines in the mid-70s, just to see the evolution of Chardonnay through that time. And the wines have never been better. They've never been more interesting. So should we taste some wine?
Yeah, we should. I just want to make me think about a comment. Etienne Griveau has a great quote in the New France from Andrew Jefford, which is nearly 20 years old now, that book, but still an absolutely classic read. And he talks about the influence of the New World winemaking on driving them in Burgundy to greater heights. And it was just a really interesting thing to read. And I think, that journey in Burgundy, has been very dynamic as well. And when we think about what they've been through with Premox, and we think about how they now make the wines and handle the wines and protect the wines, and the story of sulfur dioxide and reductive winemaking and pH, I think are all things that we'll touch on, because they're all quite live topics. And from a study point of view, I think if there's one thing that one piece of advice that I think is worth considering, it's getting a really strong understanding of SO2 and its role and its properties, and also a really strong understanding of pH and how those two interplay with each other. And it's just something that I think is, they're really foundational things to understand that will be useful for you for a long time. So why don't we take, say, 6 to 8 minutes to taste through, and yeah, make some notes and give some thought to these 5 wines in front of you.
I will mute you guys if you'd like, so you can taste in quiet.
Yeah, maybe mute us.
Yeah, okay.
Too much slurping and.
All right, so I'm going to keep an eye on the clock, everybody that's watching. I will take everybody off mute as far as panelists, so not myself, I guess, but David and Michael at about 5:25. We'll give us about 9 minutes.
Maybe.
I've unmuted you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I just want to kind of speak to the group, I guess. I've had a couple of people text me offline. Apparently you can read my lips because I said, wow, these are really fucking good. And I obviously know what the wines are, but stellar lineup. And I can totally, like, if I didn't know, I would totally I would get lost. But yeah, so.
Yeah, and it's great. I guess if it works to get some comments and feedback, you know, on the wines as we go through, then that's great because, you know, just to give the wines a bit of airtime before we reveal.
Sure.
Is
Sure.
good.
So maybe we can have some people, if anybody's got, you know, comments that they want to put either in the chat or the Q&A, if anybody wants to send those through now, we can kind of talk through them as we go. I think that would make the most sense. Michael, did you want to say something?
It might just be nice to just talk about a little bit about the whole bracket, and before we dive in, and while people maybe make some comments.
Okay, cool. I'm going to mute myself.
Not quite, except for they're almost. I mean, they're all young wines. I think we've got 4 17s and an 18. But yeah, I mean, it is a super exciting bracket, isn't it? And I mean, one of the things for me is the acidity through this bracket is fascinating because there's really good acidity right through, but it presents in different ways. And you see wines where Malo is more prominent, and where Malo is kind of, you know, less prominent, but in some cases still there. It's one of the hardest things, I think, to identify, you know, the level of Malo in a wine. Sorry, Abby, you got a comment?
What was that question that came up?
Yep. So first question I have, I'll get to that first one later, Barclay, I promise. So second question is, most of the people that are going to be on this call are on the Court of Master Sommeliers path. But Dustin is wondering, as MWs, how you guys would approach comparative tasting of the same variety that could be possibly different or give a different perspective as to how people are brought up through the court.
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, the major difference is that, you know, one is very verbal and one is completely, you know, based on writing, so they are completely different. I find that the place to start is a really good grown-up wine tasting note. And by that, I don't mean 9 adjectives that you've just plucked from somewhere that you've written down. I'm talking about, you know, having a proper look at the colour, the clarity, having a look at the aroma and the bouquet of the wine, but in a proper way, really trying to get a sense about the role of the fruit, the ripeness of the source area, the role of the winemaking, if you like, those secondary characters of oak, barrel ferment, malolactic, really trying to drill down into that wine. And then when you get to the palate, things like alcohol, acidity particularly, will really give you some indication about where you're going. But unless you have a really proper tasting note that you can refer to, and then you use your, you know, Sherlock Holmes-like deductibility, you know, deducing where the wine comes from by the level of acidity, the role of the oak, the ripeness. You know, I think that's the only way you can do it. So if you don't get your tasting note right, you just might as well close your eyes and throw a dart.
Yeah, the quote, "Taste like a detective, write like a lawyer," is one that was drilled into us in the MW program, and it was really about if you're going to say something about a wine, you've got to be able to justify it, and you need to justify, you need to justify it in your notes. So it's really about giving the evidence and what's the conclusion from that evidence. So
yeah,
that was drilled into us. The other thing for me and a lot of other people in the Master of Wine program was that we were encouraged to use tasting grids, and everyone kind of had their own favourite way of doing it. But the idea is that you've got a checklist of things that you are not missing, so that every wine you taste, if you're filling in the grid, you've got a place to put acid, alcohol, residual sugar if it's there, tannin, body, oak, and so on. You've got that checklist, and that way you don't miss anything. And obviously there'll be wines where residual sugar is irrelevant, where tannin is not very relevant, but you're going through the checklist, and you avoid then making mistakes that are really, you have a 12.5% white wine that you're putting in Condria or something. Just really, you avoid clangers, I guess, by using a grid. And that would be a different process in CMS, but mentally having those checklists, I think, is a useful thing.
So the sort of thing I would be saying, for example, would be on that first wine. Yep, if you have a look at it, it's pale, almost colourless, but it's got a green tinge. So it's fairly obvious to see that it's a pretty young wine. It's a young wine because of its clarity, but also because of that slight green tinge. So by mentioning those, you're already given a reason why you think it's a young wine. I think it's a young wine because, for example, then you might go to the nose of the wine, and for me, I see a touch of reduction, touch of struck match. I also see some really tight, quite concentrated, cool climate Chardonnay fruit. So what's that? Well, it's not tropical, it's not ripe pear, it's far more in a citrus mode. So for me, with Chardonnay, you go citrus, stone fruit, pear, tropical, for example. So for me, this is right this comes from a very cool place. And I think that's before you've even tasted it. Then you start to taste it, and you can see that wine has an absolute core of linear acidity that goes right down the tongue. The acid is quite confronting. So, you're using that to say, yes, I think it comes from a cool place. Now, then the question is, what could that cool place be? It could be, can I give some examples that will reveal? It could, for example, be Chablis, right? Because a lot of Chablis looks that colour, the absence of oak, but because I do see some oak on that palate, that makes me wonder whether or not it's kind of like a really kind of more modern style, Chablis with a bit of oak, or does it come from a really cold place that's making, more modern styles? And the intensity of flavour in the mid palate, to me. That's how it is.
You ready for that one to be revealed, Abby?
Yep.
I mean, if you guys want to, this is your show.
No, I think so, because it talks to the logic. So in this case, this is Tolpuddle Chardonnay from Tasmania. It's 2018, and the things that we would expect from Tasmania is exactly that.
Did you see ours is 17? Did you see 17?
No, we're on 18.
Okay, we're not there yet. So you guys here in the States, you've got 17.
Anyway, the point would be, the expectation would be that it's relatively pale, that it has this line of acidity, that it isn't skinny though. it still has flavour. It has flavour intensity and length. There is a roll of oak in that wine, but it's fairly quiet. And most importantly, it's got a tension and, it's got a tension around the acidity and the flavour.
Yeah, this nervosity, I think, for me, is a word that really comes up in this wine, and also this idea of a spine of acidity, and that really is typical of what we see out of Tolpuddle Vineyard. This just long line of acid, and it reminds me, it has overtones of that champagne acidity, where you've got this great long line of acid with flavour attached all the way through, and it really helps define the palate shape. The other thing I just wanted to say, and this goes back to the question that was asked about comparative of a variety, is that what Michael was starting to do there is use a whole lot of theory knowledge. And we talk about in the MW program of, you have the tasting or the practical exam, and you have the theory exam, and you have the research project. But the tasting exam includes a huge amount of theory. If you don't know, and you haven't, if you don't know the way that Chardonnay is made in different cool climates around the world, then it's hard to talk about those options, when you're, and hard to mount an argument where you're saying it could be this or it could be that. It really does require a lot of theory. So there, in the MW approach, you do need to demonstrate, even if you're getting the wine incorrect, that you're choosing between a few options that are very logical, and that you understand all of those places, so that if you put a Chardonnay from Tasmania in a certain part of the US, for example, and you would know this a lot better than me, that there are some places in the US where that would be logical, and that would be a fair mistake, and there are other places and styles where it wouldn't fit at all. So your theoretical knowledge going into that exercise is really important.
And one of the most frustrating for some people doing the MW exam, is that they might have got the wine right or almost right, but the MW exam is like doing mathematics. You have to show your workings. So in this case, with that first wine, you might say, because of its high acidity and lack of obvious oak, I think that this wine comes from Chablis. Now, you're not going to lose all your points in that situation. In fact, you could still do quite well on that wine, because you've talked about its cool origins, the acidity, the structure of the wine, which leads you to there. So that's one of the principal differences. Rather than just having a light bulb moment and writing down what you think the wine is, you have to explain why you think the wine tastes like it is. How do you think that's looking?
Yeah, it's looking super young and fresh and intense. Yeah.
Quick question for you guys, if you don't mind. Do you know the ML or new oak on the Tolpuddle? Which I'm hoping you both do.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's a full Malo, which is, goes back to that comment about it being, because when I look at this wine, I would not necessarily, if I didn't know it had been through a full malolactic fermentation, I'm not sure that I would have identified that. It's very, it's very difficult, and it's also worth understanding the way that leaving the wine on lees in barrel, post-ferment and post-malo will, the lees will eat up the diacetyl, creamy, buttery malo characters. So the way that it's treated can offset the apparent presence of malo.
Yeah, so always used to confused me, because I never understood why Malo was so loud and so diacetyl in some parts of the planet, and yet in other places you could have a wine that had gone through 100% Malo but was still tight and, you know, didn't show any of those characters. So that's 100%. The new oak is
it's about a third new French oak, and it is barriques. We do quite a bit of work with 500 litre puncheons as well. So we find with Tolpuddle that it has a lot of energy and it needs oxygen and it needs the smaller oak format. So, you know, it actually sees, you know, we consider a third new oak to be a fair whack of new oak, but it is a wine that tends to eat up the oak so that it's not terribly apparent. And
that wine without malolactic would be like battery acid. So the whole idea about malolactic is that it's, you know, bringing a wine into balance and whatever, and that's why it's so important in Chablis as well, because it's not just about the flavour profile that malolactic gives, it's about the acid reduction and the overall balance of the wine. It's important to remember that.
Couple more, if you guys don't mind. Just a couple more questions, and then we'll go on to number 2. I'm going to try to keep this up to date. Alcoholic fermentation in wood for Tolpuddle, yes or no?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And
all
then
fermented in oak. Yep. A third new and the balance old. Yep.
And then finished pH and acid on the Tolpuddle.
pH it's always pretty low. It would be it'd be about 3.1 or lower. 3.1 up to 3.15 in that sort of range. Yeah. So it's a pretty low pH. The acid would be about 7. Yeah.
I mean,
we can send you through some of those numbers after, if you like. Yeah.
If you're tasting Tasmania and you're trying to look for something that becomes a hook for Tasmania, James Halliday always talks about Tasmanian acidity. And it's a really good concept, because what he's saying is that first of all, the wines have quite bracing acidities, the red and the white, which is true. But it's also part of their personality, in the same sense that acidity is part of the Mosel, or it's part of Chablis, or it's, you know, it's part of the personality. So when we look at Tasmanian Chardonnay, we don't see the wines as having excessively high acidity. We just see that as an expression of what happens when you grow Chardonnay in that part of the world. And I love it for its freshness and its drive and its challenging acidity.
Yeah. Okay, wine 2. This wine, this we're on a slightly different wine to you guys over there. So
maybe someone can text in or however this works and just give a rough indication of origin, perhaps.
Yeah, if somebody wants to just think where they think number 2 is from, and just to clarify, I know Taryn said it in the chat, I misspoke. 2018 was what we had for Tolpuddle. The rest are 2017, as you alluded to. So I've got some answers coming in. First one is Chablis.
good.
Okay, well, we'll see you later. Thank you. We can teach you nothing. No, exactly.
Yeah, and so the wine we have is it's slightly different to yours because we couldn't find it here, but we're both drinking Premier Cru Chablis. The one you've got is from the western edge of the appellation, from Voligno. Again, it's 2017, and it's a. Do you have the bottle there, Abby? Anyway, it's a Louis Moreau.
I have my butler bringing it.
Good. I knew it'd come in handy. Yeah, cool. So LeMire, Valigno, yeah, so from the Western Edge, quite a cool site. And you know, so and they're not using any oak at all. So it's pretty, you know, pretty classic Chablis production methods, and an area that's really going to show that cut and that coolness of Chablis. The one we're looking at is from the right bank, that one being from the left, and we're looking at a Monte de Tonnerre, which is a little bit fleshier. And I don't know what it's like for you guys, but the malo is much more apparent in the Chablis than it is in the Tolpuddle. So you know, it's a little bit softer. There's a little bit more creaminess, and you know, pH would not be very different, but the presentation and the nature of the acidity in the malo presents very differently.
Yes, it's interesting when you think about the true nature of Chablis, because, you know, I like to look at, you know, site, climate, how the grapes are grown, how it's made, and what the philosophy is, and that's how we follow this book. So I quite like that. So for me, the fact that you've got the site climate is that it's really cold, and in this case, a cool vintage. You've got very well drained limestone based soils, which is important, but not because of the minerality or anything. You know, it's important because they are low, that the fertility is low, and because they're well drained, you get virtually no herbaceousness in that associated with the cooler site. So when I pick up Chablis and I see that sort of slightly honeyed character that you get in some of them, to me that's, you know, cool grown Chablis or Chardonnay without much oak influence or none. And, you know, I get that slight honey character, which for me comes from malo, but it's associated with malo in a very cool place. How's yours looking? Is yours looking obviously fairly classically Chablis?
So I'd love for people to weigh in. My personal take on this wine, just based on everything they're saying, that's what I would expect. But I do feel like this wine, to me today, is showing much riper and, I mean, more tropical, more voluptuous, a lot richer. It's got beautiful acid to it. The structure's there, but it's just showing bigger than what I would have expected. So
I think this is where it's important, you know, for us to know our vintages. And you know, 17 was typified by, you know, very bad frosts. So you had very low yields, and associated with the low yields, you get a lot of concentration. So you know, if you read around, you'll find that sort of 17s are noted for their concentration, their power, but also their acidity at the same time. So it is quite reassuring when you taste these wines and go, yeah, well, you know, that's why they taste like they do. And that's my point, I think, with a lot of tasting, is you need to be sort of thinking, you know, they taste this way because.
Yeah, and there's also this sense of finding balance and adjusting your approach, you know, for the fruit that's coming in and for the site. And in our case with Tolpuddle, you know, using small oak, whereas for some other Chardonnays we make from the Adelaide Hills, we're using larger format, is about responding and bringing that wine, giving it air, which that wine needs for balance. In the case of that Valigno, I note that they pick it a few days later than they pick the Vaillant, because it's obviously a cooler site, and it has, you know, it's got some quite cool breezes that come down the gully there, and so that's probably contributing to offset the coolness of that site. They're giving a little bit more time on the vine.
I'm a huge fan of Chablis. I love it. I love the fact that it's so wonderfully Chablisian. You know, it comes from one place. It's got the acidity. It's got the drive. You know, good examples, and also they don't make your eyes bleed in terms of the pain of paying for them. You know, they still are, you know, relatively well priced in that world. So, you know, I drink a lot of Chablis, I buy a lot of Chablis, I like Chablis.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions before we move on to the next wine. First one, if I can do like rapid fire to you. I feel like I just did a Jane Ferrari, sorry. Why do we not associate reduction in Chablis like in the Côte d'Or, or wine made in the Côte style like Tolpuddle? Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
And then I have another question, so I'll let you answer and then I'm going to come back on.
Yeah, that's interesting. It hasn't had an evolution in terms of its reductive personality. I think the way that those places have, that's true. Not something I've given a huge amount of thought to, I guess, but you know, it's part of reductive. You know, we had a great visit, I think you were there, to Dominic Lafon years ago, and we were talking about Premox and reduction, and he had really embraced, he talked about this edge of reduction, this positive reduction. And part of that was a response to Premox, which Chablis never had the same Premox issues that the Côte d'Or had. So I think that might be part of it. And maybe also part of it is when you're starting from the place that they're starting with from, in terms of, you know, such a cool climate and low pHs, the relationship with SO2 is a bit different. You know, they probably always were. I mean, they've had high sulfurs, but they probably haven't had the high solids in the ferments that we associate with.
Yeah, maybe that is that. Because I don't know the answer, but I think David's on. You know, when you get a wine that's got a lot of sulfur in it from Chablis, it tends to have a lot of free sulfur. And that's what you pick up on. It doesn't seem to manifest itself in the same reductive form that you would see, you know, further south. Very good question.
And then
we'll go and find someone who knows.
Well, it's funny. Mark's in the background, like giving me an answer, and I'm like, ah.
What's Mark saying?
What's Mark saying?
He's cooking now. No, it was on the same realm as what you were saying, David. So I agree. Yeah. I think that he's on the same page. But then the next question, and I think it's probably been answered already just by what you said, but Rebecca asked, there's something smoky about this wine with little or no oak. Is this a result of sulfur or terroir?
Yeah, we don't have the same wine in front of us. Yeah, I mean, you do often get a smoke, you know, what people describe as a smokiness. And I think we've got to be careful about that, more and more careful about using that descriptor, because, you know, there are wines that have a smokiness to them, or something we describe as smokiness, and now there's a whole other realm of smoke taint, which we you know, have become pretty paranoid about here, and we're kind of make sure that we avoid. But yeah, in the case of Chablis, I think of, you know, sometimes a smoky character as being more a terroir derived note. But I'm a bit wary about using that word now.
I mean, I'm in the main like, you know, the sort of words for me: austere, steely, oyster shell, mineral, precise, exact. You know, this is the sort of thing that that most Chablis, you get some people like Ravenot and things, which are, I think, first of all, Ravenots, and secondly, Chablis. You know, it doesn't always seem, you know, they're wonderful wines, but they don't always look, you know, Chablis, whereas hopefully the wine you have in front of you does look like that. We go to third.
Yep. Ours was a Christophe Monté-de-Tonnerre, just for your information, which is looking good, but you know, the Malo's a little bit more prominent. Wine 3. It's interesting because you know, there's almost a smokiness, you know, a smoky note to this wine as well. But yeah, we're not talking fire smoke.
They always say that you can't ever evaluate your own children very successfully. You're either too hard or too harsh, or not harsh enough. That is Shaw & Smith M3 17 Chardonnay from the Adelaide Hills, and you know, it's a wine that we've always rated really highly because it comes from a cooler year. 17 really throughout Australia, but particularly in our part of the world was, you know, pretty cool. And in a way, it sums up some of the things that I was trying to say and David was saying earlier about these wines that are grown in cooler places. And you know, for me, the Adelaide Hills descriptor, for me, I've got pale straw, hint of reduction, stone fruit, nectarine characters. And for me, that's always a really good guide to the Adelaide Hills. It's not riper than that, but it's not citrusy. So for me, it's far more in that stone fruit, nectarine character, great acidity, you know, really nice length of acidity, more mid-palate weight than wine 1, which once again you would expect because the Adelaide Hills is a bit warmer. Maybe that's the wrong word. It's not as cold as Tasmania. And really nice persistence of flavour in there. So part of the problem is when you get too much dominance of anything. So if you have too much dominance of oak, too much dominance of Malo, too much dominance of really anything in the winemaking, I think becomes unbalanced. For me, you can still see the expression of fruit in that wine, but it's modified by the process. And, you know, I think it's been well modified. It's complex, but it's still got a fruit heart.
Yeah, and it's an interesting contrast with the Tolpuddle, I think. Partly, one of the contrasts is the acidity. They've both got plenty of acid, but there's a, you know, I use that word nervosity of acid I really see in the Tolpuddle, whereas in the Shaw & Smith, the acid's bright, but you do have just a little bit more flesh in the mid palate and toward the back, and there's a restraint in both of them. But when we talk about that sort of logic and of understanding the way wines are made and their styles from different places, I think when I think about that Tolpuddle and other areas in Australia where you would go, I think you'd probably go to the Yarra Valley if you missed it for Tasmania, because they make such quite lean type wines.
But only Yarra Valley heights.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you need to break the Yarra Valley into, it's quite different. You've got these warming valley floor, and then you've got these quite austere, challenging sites at much higher altitude. So when you're looking at Yarra Valley, you really do need to differentiate between lower and higher.
Yeah. And in some of those Yarra Valley wines, they're not using Malo, and this almost looks like, you know, you could confuse it with a wine that the Tolpuddle that hadn't had much Malo.
One of the big changes in Australia had been not only have been going to cooler sites and all the other things that we've mentioned, but it's a respect of natural acidity. And I think, you know, in the 80s, as in, you know, many winemaking countries, you know, acid addition was fairly common. These days, from a philosophical and also a point of necessity, is that if you protect natural acidity and you pick early enough, you don't need to acidify. So the other thing that's exciting about the best Australian Chardonnays at the moment is that they are quite, you you know, the wines that are not tampered with in any way. You know, they're getting it right in the vineyard. They're not having to make any additions, and yet the wines still have fabulous acidity, fabulous drive, and it has changed the shape of them. You know, they're not nearly as fat as they were, and the flavours are more restrained, and you know, they're better wines because of it.
And as that's happened, alcohols are lower as well. So these ones, they're both 13.0 on the label, which, you know, if you go back 15, 20 years, you know, it's quite a big, you know, probably 1% of alcohol lower than the Chardonnays that were being made 15 years ago.
Also, that wine, you know, some of you that might remember seeing them some years ago, they were a bit richer, they were a bit fuller, and we've intentionally, you know, some old dinosaurs like myself have finally come around and realised that, you know, David and Adam might have been correct, and we are picking earlier. And I think, once again, I love the wines more. I like the wines now more than I liked them before.
And they've got a real evolution ahead of them, which is, you know, there's the flavours are quite restrained, you know, and there's a delicacy to them, and we try and protect that delicacy by using larger. We use a lot of 500 litre puncheons for that M3, and you get this really nice white flowers and you know, a bit of citrus and a touch of, you know, white nectarine, but it's not that sort of opulent stone fruit into tropicals that Aussie Chardonnay used to have.
So just for fun, you've got wine 4 and 5. One of them comes from Australia, one of them comes from France. Just
so
for fun.
Before we get there, I have a question. And it comes from Jim Boob, and he wants to know, where do you think about Margaret River fitting stylistically among these wines? And if I can just interject for a hot second, to your point with regard to style, I do think it's interesting to talk about Australian Chardonnay and its evolution, because I remember getting into wine, and Australian Chardonnay was, or not Australian Chardonnay, Australian wine in general was my jam. And at that time, Chardonnay from Australia was like fat and flabby and disgusting, to be completely honest. And I feel like now,
I think disgusting is a bit severe.
You know, I mean, I feel like I can just, you know, speak my truth here. But I think it's interesting to see, to your point, we have, you know, 2 more wines. One of them is an Aussie still. So 3 out of 5 wines are from Australia. And I think it's really cool to see the evolution of those then become, you know, a piece of that global benchmark, if you will, stylistically. So I guess, how would you answer Jim's question of where do you see?
Well, can we first of all,
Yes.
each of them just say, which is the Australian wine, 4 or 5? One is French, one is Australian. So just all of you, just, you know, just note that, because the Australian wine is from Margaret River. So we can then, so has everyone worked out which wine is which? Anyone want to let Abby know what they think?
I'm waiting patiently.
While you wait
Quick
patiently,
silence.
I think Margaret River, when we think of all the top Chardonnay regions in Australia.
We have an answer. Sorry, don't mean to interrupt you. 2 people are saying that number 4 is Margaret River, and one person thinks that number 5 is Premier Cru Bone.
That's fine. Everyone's on the right.
Yeah.
Everyone's on the right thing. So yes, wine 4 is from Margaret River.
Okay.
So David.
Yeah, I was just going to say. So when we go through, you know, top Australian Chardonnay regions. So you know, Margaret River, Adelaide Hills, Yarra Valley, Tasmania. You've got Mornington Peninsula, not so much from Gippsland, Beechworth. Pretty much the warmest, you know, and we probably don't put Hunter Valley in there in Australia because there's the odd strong Chardonnay from Hunter Valley, but it's not really the Hunter Valley's thing. But out of all those regions, Margaret River is the warmest. You know, it's really at the warm end of quality Chardonnay production. And I think, you know, I always kind of question, we always used to talk about how Pinot is so fussy about where it gets grown and Chardonnay is so forgiving. And there's some truth to that, but there's also this, you know, this sense that if you actually want to make really good Chardonnay, that's pretty fussy as well. You know, you can make Chardonnay anywhere, but you can only make good Chardonnay in a handful of places, you know, in our experience at least. Margaret River, though, it is at the warmer end. Because it juts out into the ocean, you do get these breezes, and you get quite a big difference between different parts of Margaret River, depending on what's more coastal and what's a little bit more inland. And there's just a natural richness and generosity. And I think what we've seen them doing in recent years is really balancing that natural richness by picking earlier, by being more careful in their élevage, so that you do get wines now that they still have this heart of generosity of Margaret River, and I think this wine has that, but they're not, you know, they're not overblown. You know, they still have good acidity. You know, they're careful with their malo, they're careful with their picking times, and so I think you know, they've got into a really good place. But along the way, there have been some wines that have been picked too early and have been, you know, just not ripe because they're worried about them being too big. And we used to see a lot of wines that were too big. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, for me, Dave's completely correct. It is a warm place, but these cool breezes that come in every afternoon and chill down. So the best Chardonnay vineyards are by the coast. And if it wasn't for, and it's once again, it's a terrific example if you're writing something about the, you know, the importance of sight, that these cool winds that come in the afternoon cool everything down, and that saves Margaret River. That's the first thing. Secondly, the most famous Chardonnay from Margaret River is probably Lewin, and Lewin was always on the bigger side. Interestingly, less so now. It's actually fine down. Even Lewin has fine down, you know, after all these years. So there has been a change. For me, I always see a hint of pear, whether fresh pear or dried pear, in Margaret River. I don't see citrus that much because it's just not cold enough. I rate it. I think in blind tastings, Margaret River does fabulously well because there is a richness and mid-palate intensity in the best examples that are really, you know, pleasing. I think that's a...
Yeah.
So it is?
Yeah, so that is Haze Free in glass 4. Abby, can you now hit the button on that email with the booklet? Yeah. And I should just mention that there are some climate figures in the booklet. These have come from a variety of sources, including Gladstone's Viticulture and Environment, which is a great book if you're a you know, a climate and soil and viticulture nerd. John Gladstone, Viticulture and Environment. And also a few other sources, but we've got things in there like heat degree days. These are Celsius heat degree days. Mean January temperature, continentality, which is just the difference between the hottest month and the coolest month. the mean temperature of the warmest month and the difference between that and the coldest month. So Margaret River has a very low continentality. You know, when you think of places with super high continentality, think Barolo and those sorts of places. And Burgundy's also got a pretty high continentality. And there's a bit of rainfall data. Margaret River's also got super high rainfall. And that's one of the anomalies with Tasmania, in southern Tasmania. That's got lower rainfall than the Adelaide Hills or Margaret River, even though it's cold, it's not wet, which is part of the environment that's important there for getting it right.
This is Vasse Felix, obviously, Heytesbury, 17, cool year right across most of the major areas, particularly in Margaret River. I think the product information thing says it was the coolest year for 10 years. No, 3 weeks later. Now they picked 3 weeks later than the average harvest temperature over the time of the last 10 years. So that's quite interesting. So it's cool, but it's not skinny. It's not underripe in any way. It's got lovely flavour, terrific acidity, nice drive. You know, Virginia's a very good winemaker, and you know, I think the interesting thing about that wine is it's got over 50% new oak. And whenever I see Heytesbury and I taste it, I go, where does that new oak go? It sucks up the new oak and carries it in a really good way, because it doesn't obscure the fruit, for me anyway, in any way. You know, the new oak just becomes part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a real juiciness and lovely flow to this wine. You know, it's and that is one of the nice things about Margaret River, is you get this lovely richness of texture. Abby.
Sorry, I'm raising my hand for people. What's the mallow on this wine? Wondering if they used more in 17 since it was a cooler vintage. I can answer that if you guys.
I might be wrong, but I just got a feeling that I think Virginia just lets the mallow rip.
So typically she does, and I'll just interject. So with 16 and 17, 16 was the first vintage that was 100% mallow on all the Chardonnays. And then that also followed suit with 17.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't surprise me. One, because I think she feels that the wines just carry it, and you don't get a lot of that diacetyl character there. Secondly, it seems balanced. And three, philosophically, I think she just likes the idea of, if the mallow happens, it happens.
No, absolutely.
I think
absolutely.
it lines up with the philosophy of what Virginia is trying to do.
But with the 16 and the 17, to your point with Tolpuddle and the mallow, had she not, and it all happened with heat lamps, it was all very natural, but had she not encouraged it in that way, to your point with the Tolpuddle, it would have been like drinking battery acid, and not something we could put in bottle. So
yeah, and 17 was cool. It was cool for us too, and late, and you know, those vintages are nice. You know, although they're nerve-wracking because you're waiting around and, you know, worrying that you're going to get hit by a shower or something. But 17 was, you know, one of the cooler later vintages that we've had over the last decade in Australia, in a lot of parts of Australia.
So, somewhat labouring the point, but you've got a wine from Tasmania, a wine from Adelaide Hills, and a wine from Margaret River, which are, you know, a fair way away from each other in a fairly vast continent, and yet, you know, each of those wines are showing, one, their own personality, but also, I think, showing a real quality, which is of interest to people who like fine wine.
Yep. I should just point out these notes which Abby's emailed to you. The wines are not in the order that you're tasting, of course. They're just in because the tasting order was all randomly done. So yes, we come to the last wine, which by process of elimination is from Meursault, and a house called Xavier Monod, which is sold by the same team as our wines are sold in Chicago. I visited Monod a couple of years ago. He's a really lovely guy. He's just right on the edge of Meursault, and it's the old René Monnier estate. So he's got some really smart vineyards, and this is Chevalier, which is part of a strip of these lieux-dits in Meursault, and it's important to really understand, because the lieux-dit concept in the Côte d'Or is at its most important in Meursault. Obviously, there are no Grand Crus, there are very strong Premier Crus, and there are these selection of excellent lieux-dits, which some people would used to refer to as the deuxièmes, the second Crus in Meursault. So they're good sites. This is part of that strip of lieux-dits just above the town of Meursault. And then you've got another strip. So this sits, you've got Tesson, Rougeot, Chevalier, which we've got here. Then the next one along is Luchette, and then Mieux-Chevaux. So that's that grouping of lieux-dits, which tend to be a little bit richer and more generous than the ones that are a bit higher and up in the hills. So yeah, it's have a go back to your map afterwards or now, and just of the different vineyards in Meursault, and see where it sits and how that wine presents, because there is some generosity there. There's good fresh acid, but there's some textural quality in that wine as well.
I've always found Meursault confusing these days, because it always used to be the easiest to pick, because Meursault was always more chunky, not as refined. I always found it quite easy to pick in my MW preparation. It never had the cut of Polini. It never had the refinement of Polini. It certainly didn't look like Chablis. There was a thickness is the wrong word, but you know what I know. You know what I mean. And then suddenly Rouleau came along, started picking earlier and making these absolutely wonderful but completely confusing people who were used to what he changed the way Meursault tasted. And of course now you can break you sort of say Meursault, well, okay, is it traditional Meursault, i.e. more chunky, more four square, or is it kind of more racy, more reductive, more modern Meursault? So it doesn't become any easier.
But you still, even in some of those wines, you can still, I think, sometimes see this exotic character to the fruit that you get in Meursault, which is less in that the lemony aspect that you see a bit more of in Polini, and more getting into things like guava, and there's a bit of guava, a bit of apricot in this wine. There is some exotic fruit and some richness, and there's an openness, which is that more traditional Meursault personality.
I think once again, the Malo in that wine is, that slight caramel hint, I think is probably Malo derived. It's not, it's quite loud in that wine, but I still quite like it. It sits comfortably, and cool year, once again, low crops, cool year. So sometimes when you get these really low crops and the cool year, you get slightly atypical wines.
We've had that this year in the Adelaide Hills, and it's really interesting because it was slightly later, marginally later than normal, But when you consider that the crops were 30% down, and then it was still later, because normally if the crops are 30% down, we'd be in a normal season, we might be 2 weeks earlier because there's that much less fruit that the vine's got to ripen. So you've kind of got these two things, you know, working against each other. And you're getting good acids and concentration, but sadly small crops. And they've certainly had their share of small crops over there in the last few years.
Okay, I've got questions.
Yep. Cool.
You're not off the hook yet. Because we've got a few people that are starting to chime out, so I just want to get some of these answered. So the first one is thoughts on brown juice for Chardonnay production.
Yeah, we're oxidative, so it's a really interesting contrast for us because we work with Sauvignon Blanc where we're quite reductive, quite protective. So we're using, you know, we're keeping the juice quite green. We're putting some inert gas in the press, that sort of thing. Whereas the Chardonnay is completely oxidative and completely brown juice.
Yes, having said that though, just have to correct, you know, before, I think this idea of hyper-oxidation, you know, where you've actually oxidized it so much that any fruit life that you had is gone. What we do is we hand pick and then we put the grapes in a cold room for about 36 hours, roundabout or less. So when we use no chemicals, no sulfur, but when we press, we're pressing cold grapes and therefore cold juice. So we do get some protection from oxidation from the temperature, but we are not at all worried about some oxidation of the juice because it's kind of going to happen anyway. So we believe that it's better to happen then than later.
Yep.
Next question, which two wines do you think tasted most similar to each other?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Tolpuddle kind of sits apart. Our Chablis kind of, you know, was quite Malo-y. The M3 had this kind of brightness and punchiness. Maybe the last two, for me, texturally is important, and they both had this, you know, this kind of rich texture. So either 4 or 5. The other argument would be 3 and 4. But what do you think, Michael?
I think Tolpuddle looks like it comes from one place, which is Tasmania. So I think that's on its own. No, I actually see similarities between the M3 and the Vasse because I think both of them are using older vines, picking to keep natural acidity. There's a combination of fruit and process in the wine, and yet there's an overall freshness and style. So for me, probably Vasse and M3. Yeah.
Okay, I hope you're ready for this one. I'm just going to read it. If I may ask an uncomfortable question, Tolpuddle is a close ringer. Oh, this isn't me asking, I would just ask. Tolpuddle is a close ringer for Chablis and certainly is as great of a style of wine deserves. And certainly as it's a great style of wine, it deserves imitation, but Tolpuddle retails $55 to $60, whereas you can get a good quality Premier Cru Chablis for less. How do we get customers to try these for more than their source style?
Well, first of all, I think that I kind of understand what you're saying, but no one is trying to imitate Chablis here. This is what happens when you grow Chardonnay at 15, 20 years old. in a really cool place. And my sense is that the excitement for me is when someone says, God, that is fabulous, and B, that really tastes like Southern Tasmania. Because what we tend to do is, we tend to, if someone says to me, oh, that tastes like Le Clos, for example, or it tastes like a Premier, of course I'm happy about that. Of course I'm happy about that. But I'm going to be a lot more excited by when someone says, this is not an imitation, this is really exciting Chardonnay grown in Southern Tasmania. Or the Vasse Felix is just a crackingly good Chardonnay that's grown in Margaret River. If someone wants to make some comparisons, that's fine. But that's not what's driving us.
Yeah, and in terms of price, I mean, I think, you know, it's something that we've, you know, when I say we, I mean people making wine in the new world, be it in, you know, the Napa Valley or Sonoma Coast or Tasmania or Margaret River. You know, we all have this, you know, this need to establish our wines and be proud of them and not, you know, undervalue them. And so I think we've got to, you know, we've got to make the prices, you know, reassuringly expensive.
Also, you know, it's a single vineyard. It's a monopole. The other point I'd make is that what you're doing is comparing Tolpuddle with Chablis, which has already got great value. I would be more interested to compare Tolpuddle, M3 and Vasse Felix with some pretty ordinary Premier Crus from Burgundy that are going to cost a lot more than those wines. And, you know, and you either see value in that or not. I hope you do.
Okay, we'll do a couple quick questions to finish it off, and that puts us at about 90 minutes. So I know people are starting to sign up here and do dinner. Is the future of Tasmanian wine still or sparkling?
Interesting. We had this debate because everyone says, "Oh, you're going to do sparkling wine there," and I'm sure I've told you this before, Abby, but we looked at the cost, and you know, Martin Shaw was involved in the early years of Petaluma, and you know, helped establish Crozer, which is a big sparkling brand here. And we thought about all that cost and investment and time, and we thought we could just buy ourselves a pallet of Krug and it'd be a lot easier, and then we'll drink that. So we're really focused on still wine there, and that's what excites us about the Cole River Valley. And I think it's what we're going to see is more delineation between different regions in Tasmania, and it looks like sparkling wine will be the most important style from northern Tasmania, and still wine will dominate in places like Cole River Valley, Huon Valley, the Derwent down south.
I mean, for me, there's 4 wines that are really exciting from Tasmania. One is sparkling. The other one is Chardonnay, Pinot, and Riesling. They for me, are the things that, you know, if I was planting more vines down there, that's what I would be planting. Because I think that particularly the table wines have a sense of place and a uniqueness about their expression, which is worthy of attention.
I like that question, though.
That's good. So this one came right at the beginning. I want to make sure I get it in, and then I've got one more, and then we'll see where we land. So just quickly, if you guys can both share off topic, but wondering what each of you thought was the toughest part of completing the MW program. A long time ago, I know, but.
I think it's kind of, for me, I'd say one of the toughest things is the just the mental aspect and preparing yourself for the journey, which is it's going to take a few years at least. You need to be really all in and fully immersed in it, and everything else takes a back seat. So I think for me, that's a lot of it. Different people, some people find the theory part harder or the practical part harder. I think overall for me, it was just that level of commitment and immersion into it, and understanding that it's going to take a while.
Yes. I think because it's so broad in the areas that you need to know about, everyone has an area of weakness. So you've got people who are really good trained winemakers who find that the winemaking and all that stuff really easy. You've got people that are fabulous tasters that might come from an MS background. But the fact is, be sure they will find you out. Your weakness will be revealed because it's just the nature of that exam. I think the most important thing is tenaciousness. And if any of you've read Gerard Basset's dear, much missed Gerard Basset's biography, which I do recommend to you. Everyone thought that Gerard was this superhuman taster that was able to pass exams and win competitions and all that sort of stuff. You actually read the book. What is extraordinary about Gerard and his achievements was that the tenaciousness, the ability to pick himself up again after he'd failed something 2 or 3 times, or he'd come 7th at the World Sommeliers Champ, and he just picked himself up, go back again, regroup, work out. So if there's one lesson from that, is his ability to be humble enough to learn from it. It's a really good read if any of you are interested. It's just terrific from a very lovely man.
Yeah.
Okay, last question, I believe. This one is asking, it says, at our restaurant, it's important for us to have breadth and exciting varietal expression and value from around the world for under $100 for the broader US market. Is this considered in Australia regarding exports to the US, as brand building is made on premise?
Well, we love on premise, and that's been the way that Sean Smith particularly has been built. And yeah, it's heartbreaking to see what's going on and the way that things are being affected at the moment. But we are, we're very conscious, and we know, we're a lot more familiar with the price points in Australia. But I think for wines like M3 Chardonnay, them being sold at $80, $90 in restaurants has been a big part of their success here in Australia. So we are pretty conscious of that. Yeah. Tolpuddle, the volumes are a lot smaller, and it's a bit of a different evolution there. But yeah, we certainly see on premise as the place to build brands. Absolutely.
Because we all know that sommeliers will say, no, I can't possibly sell that wine because my customers don't want it, which is actually the biggest cop-out on the planet, because the sommeliers that I know could sell anything. If they're excited about a wine, if they're excited about a new producer, a new Burgundian producer, a new wine from Tasmania, someone or other, if they're excited, they will find a way to share that excitement. So I think the secret about brand building is I know it sounds ridiculously simple, but I think if you're making really exciting wines, that's a good place to start.
All right, cool. I think that's it for questions. Obviously, to everybody that's still on, if you've got follow-up from the packet that I sent, or if you need more information, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to, connect those questions to David and Michael. Everybody's saying thank you right now, so great job, guys.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Amy, for teeing it up.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I'm sure I'll talk to you soon. If this works for you, we can do some card playing. We need to make that happen still.
The Mau Mau. I need
The
the
Mau Mau. Awesome. Well, have a great rest of your day, guys, and we'll talk to you soon.
You too. Thank
Cheers.
you. Thanks for
Bye, guys.
Cheers.